If I like click slightly off of this checkbox, it will still turn it on. There's actually math that is calculating the geometry between where the pointer is and the corners of this menu.
This is like actually quite a controversial design decision.
This simple black and white app went from nothing to somehow having everyone obsessed with it.
We're going to talk about Notion.
Brand new 2025 Notion setup.
And I've been using Notion every single day.
And so, how did they do it? You see, behind any successful product, there's an insane amount of design, engineering, and psychology that most people never get to see. And to uncover it, I flew to San Francisco and I locked myself in a room with the people that actually built the product, the designers and the engineers. They opened up their design files and showed me the insane design and engineering behind things that look so simple, but hide an insane amount of complexity. But also the alternative version that they didn't ship and the mistakes they made. This gives you a sense of how much is going on behind your favorite tech products. They show me how they engineered the psychology principle that makes people so addicted to using Notion. And they do it on purpose. And how making things that look simple and minimal is actually the hardest thing in design. Oh, and how they're doing this all over again for their new email client, Notion Mail. I'm Enrico, and in this series, we go behind the scenes of the psychology, engineering, and design of the tech you use every day by talking to the people who built them. Welcome to Behind the Scenes and Stealing Coffee from Notion.
This is the intro of the video. Founder of Notion Mail wiping my computer because it's too dirty.
I'm a big laptop cleaner.
Okay, there we go. So 685 Market Street. This is Notion's office. Let's go inside.
So while the building is old and gives this oil tycoon vibes, the office itself is super minimal. They have a fetish for weird designer chairs, and from the moment you step in, it's clear that it was decorated by nerds. Because this is Douglas Engelbart, the pioneer that made the most important tech demo of all time in the 1960s. And here's a signed version of an iconic paper from Alan Kay, who basically predicted laptops and mobile devices back in 1977. This is basically live, laugh, love decor, but for computer history nerds. But let's start from the beginning, because the founders of Notion, Ivan and Simon, were able to use one of the most powerful psychology principles. And the reason why people obsessed with this tool, the IKEA effect.
Ivan and Simon, they're big fans of the web. They're big fans of technology. And as you look through the web, you actually see a lot of really, really common patterns. Every single website has headings. Excel is based on this idea of like sheets and tables that are similar to like tables you might see on Wikipedia. And we take all of those different websites and you say, hey, what are the most foundational things that help us build the things that are in these websites and in these apps? You find that there's not really that many building blocks that you need to build. And I think that was the key insight. You can do sort of all the things that someone would have done in the specialized version of the app and turn, like, for example, they have like a specialized button that does a very, very specific thing. But you expose instead this like generic button they can customize instead, and then users can package that and then turn that into whatever app that they want.
So instead of starting from a specific problem that the user had, they looked at all the tools that people were using and noticed which elements were common across them. Databases, lists, tagging elements, board views, linking to other elements. And these primitives are the Lego blocks from which you can build a lot of the specialized apps that people use. But if you grew up like me playing Legos, well, I still play with them today, just bigger ones. You know that the fun part is building that Millennium Falcon, adding and tweaking and modifying it. And whatever you create will not just be a piece of plastic, it will have a way higher value to you because you built it yourself. And this is the IKEA effect, which comes from IKEA that uses it in the exact same way. The table you built means more to you because you put your blood, sweat, and tears into assembling it with this annoyingly small wrenches that they give you. But while this is massively powerful, it comes with a big problem.
People get to this page and they have this blank canvas syndrome, right? They're like, what could I possibly build? We've tried a few different things from fills at the very bottom. I think one of the most notable that we released recently was you can go click database and then go into this database AI setup generator and then type in what you want and then it'll propose columns. You're constantly balancing this tension of like the more knobs and levers you expose, the more cool things people can make with it, but the more overwhelmed people are. The more simple terms you use in the product, the more people can understand them sometimes, but sometimes you have to introduce some complexity. Like database is a new concept. If we just call that just table, then may confuse people in general, right? Yeah. Every single new building block you add needs to sort of make sense and interop with every other building block. And it's difficult if you're constantly like building new things and some of them just don't fit together with the other sides. And so this is just like a really fun design problem we get to do every day.
But while the IKEA effect makes the system that each person creates more valuable, because They built it, they tweaked it. This also comes with a problem because now they have users that do all sorts of things with the app. So each one would have wildly different needs and wants completely different types of features. So deciding what you want to add to the app becomes incredibly hard. So you can only imagine the incredibly complex algorithms that they have developed to decide what to build next.
It's kind of vibes, right? If you come up with a new feature and then you test it against 5 use cases and it works well for one, is it better or not than something that works for 5? But doesn't do it as well. And this is a really fun challenge as well. Where we lean is like more expressivity and more flex, like across multiple use cases, but still simple enough to distill the main ideas.
What are some of the most curious and interesting things that you found by talking to users? Like, what are the things that surprised you? Like, oh shit, we never thought they would use this thing this way.
During the Notion Formulas launch, we built a programming language for Notion, right? And people were making like video games out of this, right? And things like blackjack. There's this like 2D shooter game. This was not something I thought that one could even do with the language. Like I didn't even think the language could express this.
We didn't let you change the color of the inbox icon at first because it was like a default icon. We're like, let's not have people mess with it because then they might get confused. People were so annoyed because it turns out there's a whole community of grayscale icon people. And the grayscale people wanted to turn their red inbox icon to gray so it would match the rest of the sidebar. So we had to add that as a feature.
Okay, let's take a step back. Who is this guy? This is Jason. And together with Andrew, they started building their privacy-focused email client called Skiff. Until in 2024, they got acquired by Notion and started working on what today has become Notion Mail. But the problem in creating the Lego building blocks and the IKEA effect for email is that emails today are a total mess.
Email is a fundamental set of features that have existed for 20 or 30 years. So the concepts of, inbox, send, trash, spam, and then we've built up layers and layers on top. Even archive wasn't really an email concept until a few years ago, but then we added, starred, and depending on your client, you may also have like flagged, you may also have pinned, there's important, there's checkbox. There's just kind of so many different options that are presented to you as like default in email. And we tried to rethink that. So we said, all these things, pinned, starred, flag, labels, they're all kind of the same. And some email clients even offer labels and folders and nested labels. And we just kind of basically also group those down, into the fundamental like label as a building block. So yeah, I think that's really where the challenge has been. It's like, how can we make email truly feel like this Notion style, extensible, template-based app building, experience?
I never realized it. We have like 5 different ways to mark an email that effectively do the same thing. So they had to find a way to somehow unify them, but leave the freedom for people to use each one of them if they wanted to. And they did it by making everything a customizable label, which for them is the basic Lego block. And then based on that, you can build views based on those labels that work exactly in the way that you want. But behind every Apple physical products that you use, there's dozens, maybe hundreds of alternatives that didn't make it to the final product. This was one of the first prototypes for the iPhone keyboard. It's how it almost looked. I am building my own product myself right now, and I have pages and hundreds of different concepts and designs and ideas. So what about the designs that didn't work?
We had really thought about the inbox, which is like the core part of your email experience, like 3 times over, and we even built out some of these. So the very first version, this is like one day into starting on Notion Mail, we were like, what if we approached mail from like a chat perspective? And so we had this like split view where it was less focused on the emails and more about making it feel more like messaging someone, and then being able to sort of structure around the different people that you're talking to. And so this was a very different approach to email, born out of the idea that it's so much easier to send a message over something like Slack than email, but can kind of be behind the scenes how the email is sent, and there's no real need for that. The other that we actually built out was we really wanted Notion Mail, and this is true to today, to be built in the same way that like a Notion database is, where it's very modular and it has all these different properties. And so we actually thought of your emails like a database where you could see they had these columns. So subject is actually a text column. Sender is like a people column. And then you could actually like drag and move these around the different sections. I spent like months working on this and like getting it to be like really flexible. It was so hard because basically any window could be any size. And you could add any arbitrary amount of these columns. And it's like, how do you resize it and make it so it's still clickable and editable? And like these things move around in a really smart way. And so we ended up simplifying this away and just saying, we're gonna have a more rigid structure. We spent weeks, months working on, went deep into the details, and only after living and sort of experience and sitting with it, we realized that it was overly difficult to use and kind of distracting from the things that we thought were the main actions people want to take.
Now, how did they make all these choices? Like deciding on which approach to take, what works best? Well, the number one thing everyone will tell you when you're building anything is you should talk to users and get feedback. Of course, that's true. But looks like there's another even better way.
It was built for me and Andrew. Our initial default font size is pretty small and compact. And the reason for that is if you are a startup founder, you're probably someone who actually likes to get through a lot of work really quickly. And so you don't want big text to make it simple. You want to have a compact, dense inbox so you can see all your email. That's actually a really important approach, is to build for yourself. And so if you actually use the product, you don't have to do a user survey or wait for customer feedback. You can kind of use your own intuition and judgment for deciding whether or not, hey, does this work for me?
So you know that feeling when you use a new product and it just feels good. It's very hard to put into words why, but it just does. I remember I felt this when I used an iPhone for the first time, coming from my crusty Nokia phone in middle school. Well, there's a reason why. Apple icons are not rounded rectangles. They are a different mathematical shape called a squircle that makes it more pleasing. Gmail lets you swipe from your profile picture to quickly switch between your accounts. On both Android and iOS, you can tap and drag to zoom in and out of maps. These are all little details that on their own don't change much. But if you add up 1,000 of them, this is how you get something that feels good, that almost feels like magic.
One of the key examples of this for me, when you're actually building it, you have to think about so much. So how does the arrow navigation work? Then you'll notice that it auto scrolls. You'll notice that when it auto scrolls, it scrolls with a padding on the bottom. That's not native. If you press and hold, it continues to press and hold. It gets to the bottom, it doesn't loop. If I hover and then I arrow, then it goes back. If I go to the top, it scrolls to the top. I could probably outline in anything like this that's interactive, 100, 200 sort of details and options that if you get it right, people don't even notice. But some of it can take so much time. One example is for submenus. If I hover here, you'll notice it's diagonal and it doesn't close the submenu. There's actually math that is calculating the geometry between where the pointer is and the corners of this menu, because if it closed immediately, if you go down, it would be really frustrating to go there. And so, we wrote this literal, there's all this ninth grade math in the app, and hopefully if it's done right, nobody notices it and nobody thinks about it and people take it for granted. I can't tell you how many hours we spent on bullet pointed lists and what happens when you click tab and then you backspace delete.
If you're used to using kind of any sort of editor, Notion, Google Docs, even just bullet point notation is really complicated. So I want to type Andrew, tab into another, kind of tab again. Does it create a tab? Does it go to a next indent, or does it remove the bullet point? And so the behavior kind of depends. If I'm here and then I hit tab, I'll go a further indent, but I can't then skip an indent level unless I already have something at that new indent level. So that's very deliberate behavior. Kind of the shift tab behavior to go back. Then just making sure shift tab actually deletes the bullet point. Then also just making sure it maps really nicely with the other lists. So number 1, and then making sure all of the lines in between where that typography starts are the same regardless of what type of list you're using.
When you have numbered lists, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 has 2 digits. We use a CSS thing called font variant, and we use tabular -nums. Some fonts support this. What it does is it creates a fixed size square.
It's a monospace.
Yeah,
type.
Exactly. And so even though it's not necessarily a monospace type face, it creates uniformity so that things align perfectly. Even small things too here, we added a click zone, because this is something you'll see when people actually use it. If I click slightly off of this checkbox, it will still turn it on because it's just a tricky target and people are imperfect. There's so many things like that. There's a lot of crazy math as well for just the hover states. There are so many because it's the email could be open, it could be clicked on, it could be selected. You'll notice the corners on the border radius actually update so that it matches. So you'll see this one has a top left corner. Now it fits in perfectly.
Okay.
If I hover and highlight, you'll notice this was also tricky. If I'm just hovering even, it will start to update it.
One where we tried really, really hard to make it, perfect and then also reflect how Notion is built is the mention menu. So if I start with an @mention, I see a list of almost 750 contacts here, and then the remaining 737 are grouped into more results. And I also see Notion, pages that I might search for. So one thing is then when I start typing, so let's type me, I can type, my first name, Andrew, and then hover over it and I don't see placeholder text. If I start typing, my email address, AMIL, you'll see placeholder email autofilled there. And some really special interactions too. If I left the arrow keys, I don't lose focus on the hover menu. So if I wanted to, I could delete that and then I get different results and then go back to the kind of updated placeholder text. There are just all these little things. It actually took a lot of effort to make sure that when I left arrow key there, now I'm out of the menu. But if I'm kind of just moving the cursor inside that menu, it sticks. And then of course, if you want to click on it or hit enter, what that looks like. So now let's look at the same in Notion and you'll see really similar behavior. So if I'm doing Enrico, I can see your name and I can left arrow key and then basically go around and have kind of the same cursor behavior with the @mention. So we really tried to make that perfect and it took a lot of code and time. All of this was built by us.
To design these, there's very powerful design tools like Figma. But this is not just a matter of design, because there's so many things you have to think about for each little detail that building it with real code sometimes is the only way to see how it truly feels to use.
But I think the thing that I probably spend the most amount of my time, like in terms of design work, is the other side of it. So not words, not Figma, but code. I think a lot of design is done in code because it becomes living and breathing. And so you get into a depth that you would never be able to capture in just artboards. One thing that can be extremely complicated is menus. And I can find a couple different menus. Why are menus hard? Because in Figma, it might just be like a square. You just have these menu items. But then there's like a question of like, okay, well, what happens if I have a tab or I have an input that's focused? What are the keyboard shortcuts? If I do arrow down, how does it know where to go? Does it look? You see it scrolls. It also maintains the padding there so it's uniform so it doesn't overflow. What happens if I hover over it? Now if I arrow down, it goes back to the new placement. What if I have like multiple or like I'm messing around? There could be a sub menu. There's a sub menu. How do I make it so that there's like a triangle? Now I have to calculate like the math to make sure that the sub menu doesn't close. If I press escape, does it close the sub menu first? Does it close both menus? How do I disable pointer?
And even things that are not necessarily functional but visual add on to this, like making sure that even though a page may display a lot of different things, all the icons on those different things and different elements are perfectly aligned.
Over here, you have some more icon alignment where we've aligned view icons with the page icons with the new page icon a little bit better.
So especially for an app like Notion that requires you to create your own system using the Lego blocks, small design details can make or break the entire system. For example, here I created a database, but there is no content here. I have no idea what this will look like. And that's where they spent an enormous amount of time to build details that guide you.
This is like actually quite a controversial design decision.
Okay.
And there's a little bit of debate that went behind this, right? On one hand, like if you just have like one little new page placeholder, one little row, it kind of looks like a little bit small and you don't really see exactly what you can make of it. When you have 5, it is a little bit misleading because it shows 5 items when there's no items, but it gives you a better idea of what can be there. And so some people may look at that and be like, oh, this is a little bit confusing. And some people may look at that and be like, oh, I didn't know what a table was, but now it's like much clearer.
Now, I know what many of you are thinking. Come on, what difference does it make if my bullet point navigation is not perfect, or if I need to move my mouse cursor a few pixels off? And I agree. While as a builder myself, I am fascinated by the care and design behind the details, the truth is that on their own, they don't matter. But when you add up 100, 1,000 of these, and you put hours of design and engineering in each one, that's when you get to that magical point where you get the feeling of something that feels good. And this is the secret power of good design.
One way to think about it is if you do a million of these little things over time, people will start to sense it. But I think more than that, what people sense is that the people that built it care. I think Andrew has a perspective, and it really is helpful, of like, how do we simplify and not overcomplicate the way in which we engineer these things? And then my perspective sometimes is, I will make the most terrible spaghetti code, but if it makes the product 0.1% better for the experience, I find it worth it.
Now, look at this. This is Microsoft Word 2003, and this is Notion. Which words come to mind when you look at each one? For me, it's clunky and complex, and here's minimal and simple. And when you look at the most successful technology products versus their old counterparts, this is what you see in a lot of them. Because as fellow Italian Leonardo said, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And making something simple is extremely hard.
Here we've got a board view, and right now we've got table, board, list, timeline, calendar, gallery form. And we could spend literally our entire lives adding more things to this menu. We could build a map view, an org chart view, and endless things more. And this is a big sort of interesting challenge where when you have a user-generated content platform, people will always ask for more because they're like, hey, I want to use Notion for X, or I want to format things a specific way. Where do you draw the line?
But the challenge of simplicity is that it's great for getting new users to intuitively use the product. But eventually you have to balance that with the advanced users. And the risk of getting back to this is always there.
If you draw like a user spectrum and you try to like bucketize them into their levels of experience, you have probably like 70 or 60% of people are sort of can be what we call like a resident. They're more like, just give me the tool and I'll use it. And if it looks nice, that's great, you know, but I don't want to go and tweak it all day, right? And then you have another segment, which you might call like gardeners. And these are people who are more willing to sort of learn about what is a property, like what are the different configurations of a property? How do I make it so that it reflects in my time zone or someone else's time zone? And then the next segment is like a builder, where this person like actually wants to build. And within the builders, you have an even smaller section called like an architect. And an architect is like, they're like, oh, like how does the formulas ifs function and let's function work? And how can I use that to make a really cool emoji display or like a habits tracker? Right? And a lot of people will just always be residents. And so when we're building a new feature, we have to be cognizant of like, if a resident looks at this, what are they going to think? Can they use the tool properly? If an architect looks at this, can they discover all of the complexity of the tool properly as well? Thomas, like Thomas Frank, right? Like what would Thomas think if he came on this UI, right?
He would probably want more features.
You can really make something bad if it is the average. So like there's a famous story about like the US Air Force where they like took everyone's body measurements and then they figured out the average body and then they made like a chair in the cockpit for it and it fit no one. And so I think you want to figure out who those specific users are actually and make sure that they have a way of using it in the product that is tailored to that.
So if you go in a database, right, and then you go into a page in the database and you hit customize layout, you enter this layout builder experience, right? But that level of complexity, like through customized layout, is not necessarily something that like most people have to fiddle with, right? It's not something that you want to glare on the screen that every newbie to Notion like immediately goes and gets there, but that's something that like you incrementally build over time. So after you've learned what a page is and what a database is, then you kind of go in to try out like customized layout. And then if you don't understand properties, how are you going to understand the customized layout?
Now, Notion Mail also had the same challenge, especially with their feature Auto Label. This is a powerful feature that looks at your past emails and allows you to, for example, isolate emails from salespeople by having you identify examples of those emails to train the AI. Now, this is very powerful, but also very simple and intuitive to use. But making it this simple wasn't so straightforward.
This is a feature that we've simplified more than any, which is now called Auto Label. But at Make with Notion last year, we actually presented it as something called Autopilot. And the way that the feature originally worked was that it had an input field at the bottom, showed you this sort of inbox view, and it was a complete sandbox, almost like a playground where you could do anything with your inbox besides, you just write in a prompt and then it would allow you to label, it would allow you to archive, take actions, you could even translate, extract. It was really exciting. The problem is when someone's learning about a new feature like this and they get into it, it can become very difficult to know what they're capable of if it's so open-ended. It's almost like you don't know where the boundaries or the edge, like in a video game, is until you hit it. And so what we found is that the main use case anyway was from people using it was labeling. And then when you started to focus on the labeling experience, it became much more about how do you get someone to label their emails as quickly as possible using this automated system. And so we found a way to do it without even having to type, where you basically have suggestions. And then we found a way to do it without even having prompts, where we realized, well, oftentimes people have emails in mind. And so yes, they can write and describe what they want once, but then we can augment it with actual buttons that they just click, and those are actual email.
So Notion and now Mail have become hugely popular, but so far they have avoided something that you might have noticed in other products you use, which is that somehow as they get more popular, even though they have more money and more resources, the product becomes worse. Well, there's a very specific reason why, and it's this, the law of the marginal user. And you can learn all about it in this video right here. I'm Enrico, and I'll see you in the next one.